Well, good evening. It is great to be here at Campbell University. Honored to be here with your president and mayor, President Perry and President Douglas. President Douglas reminded me that when I was leading the NAACP nationally, we chartered an NAACP Youth and College Division chapter right here at Campbell. That's one of the first that I signed the charter for. And I asked him how I was doing. He said it needs to be reestablished. So if there's anybody in the room that has a passion for that, please speak to President Perry and President Douglas. That they're eager to do what they can do to reestablish it here at Campbell. So I was flying in today. I was reflecting on a century in Oklahoma, between Tulsa, the massacre in Tulsa, and all the massacres that preceded it. I can remember when I was leading a national news service for black community newspapers, and Charles Ogletree, a professor at Harvard Law School, was working on reparations for the victims of the massacres in Oklahoma. And he was trying to prove that there had been a trend, that Tulsa was not an anomaly, that it was part of a strategy. And we were at the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, which has been in existence for well over a century, now probably 130, 140 years. And on the wall, they had a blown-up cover, front page rather, of the newspaper from, I believe, 1918. And way down in the corner was a little article about a massacre in Oklahoma the night before. And we took a photo of that, and we sent it to Professor Ogletree. We found the article, and we sent that to him too, and it helped him in that work. And I bring it up for two reasons. One, it reminds us that even in these times when it feels like there's so much left to do, that we truly have come a long way. And we can therefore have faith that we are capable of making more progress, because it's also a reminder that there have been times even tougher than these. And we prosper. But I also raise it because it reminds us just about the insanity of race. And tonight I've been asked to talk about a tough subject. I usually give a more kind of easier, more motivational speech, but it was clear this afternoon's panel, there's sort of a hunger to kind of get into the subject. So we're going to get into the origin and the forgotten consequences of race. I'd like to state the obvious, which is, as a black guy with a white dad, as a black guy who on his black side, on his mama's side, descends from Thomas Jefferson's grandma, what I'm going to talk about tonight is a family affair. I would love to say I was Barack Obama's cousin. I'm not, but he and I are both cousins. He and I are both cousins to Dick Cheney. So he is my cousin's cousin. And I just point that out, that we are all more connected than we suspect. Henry Louis Gates Jr. has been noodling over my family's DNA for several years. I was the honor to be on the show Finding Your Roots. One of his researchers reached out recently to say that on the black side, honestly, because of which plantation owner in Virginia was raping my grandmother way back, which is my black grandmother's fairer than I am, just to be clear about it. That we descend from a whole series of English and British kings, from Edward I to Charlemagne's grandfather. And why do I point that out? I point that out to make it clear. I mean, here I am, I have a white dad that comes from some of the first founders of this country, Salem Colony, 1624. I have a black mom who goes back, her family, some of the oldest plantations in Virginia, around the same era. We always knew that my dad's family ultimately went back to some French royalty and English royalty. But now it appears that my black mom and my white dad might be cousins. through English royalty and French royalty. Suffice to say, the suppositions that we walk around with about race and this imaginary wall are ridiculous. And I just want to stipulate that at the beginning. So let's talk about what we're dealing with. The first thing is that we imagine that race always existed in America as we understand it, and the simple fact is it did not. Our trouble as Americans is we remember what we see on TV or at the movies. That's about the extent of our historical imagination. And if you saw Roots or Django or 12 Years a Slave, let me fill you in on something that you may have missed. That was a portrayal of slavery near its end in America. And why is that important? Politics is a lot like physics. Every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Something in motion, and race relations in motion, race relations are always in motion. Something in motion tends to return to its original state. And our trouble is that we forget the original state of race relations in America. And I'm here to tell you that in many ways, things started off much better than they are right now. Right now, in America, in some communities, the penalty for a black man, a black young man dating a young white woman can be death. We had a case of a police officer white police officer killing his daughter's boyfriend when I was president of the NAACP, and he was let go. No penalty. What was the penalty in the earliest days of the Virginia colony? For premarital sex between a white woman and a black man? Ye shall don white robes of shame and stand at the courthouse door for the appointed number of hours or days. It was the same as it was for a white man and a white woman, or a black man and a black woman. The issue was not color. The issue was that y'all shouldn't be doing that if you're not married. How is it that President Obama, on his white mother's side, descends from a black slave? Because in the earliest days of our colonies, your status, free or slave, was determined by your mother. So a black male slave had child in Virginia with a white woman, and their children became some of the first free blacks in the Virginia colony, and President Obama descends from them. And why was that possible? Well, it was possible in part because our notion of race, our modern notion of race, had not been created. You go back and you look at the records in the earliest years of Virginia, and you'll see that African slave herdsmen were sent away in the hottest months and the coldest months to other places with the cattle only to come back. There were upside down days, days when the slave would be the master for the day and the master would be the slave. When did this begin to change? 1663 in Virginia. 300 years to the year before Martin Luther King's March on Washington is the first major rebellion in the colonies. But here's the thing. It wasn't simply a slave rebellion. No, it was my grandmother, who was a 103-year-old social worker, the granddaughter of a slave who became a state legislator and co-founded Virginia State University. My grandmother would remind us the earliest rebellions were not slave rebellions, they were colonial rebellions. And the rebellion that happened that day in Gloucester, Virginia, were Irish indentured servants and African slaves rebelling against an edict that came from the king to the governor to the people on that dock that can be summarized as, "And your status shall convey to your children." The lowest status of either parent would convey to the children. No longer would a slave man have a child with a free woman and the child be born free. The child would be property of the owner. In other words, the very beginning of the American experiment, we were willing to endure a lot so much as we could hope, so long as we could hope that our children might be better off. But the day that it became clear that our children's fate would be no better than our own, possibly worse, we would rebel, and we would rebel together. In the context of colonial Virginia, when you added up the African slaves and the Irish indentured servants, you were talking about a majority of the colonial enterprise. And it would happen again and again, right through Bacon's rebellions, I believe 1676, 100 years before the American Revolution. And when Bacon's rebellion occurred, what did they do? They began legislating clearer distinctions between Irish indentured servants and African slaves to keep us apart and make it impossible for them to unite in rebellion in the colony. But even then, as Africans were required to wear homespun, while Irish could wear European dress, while drums would ultimately be outlawed as a method of communication between African slaves. Race as we know it didn't exist. So when was it created? Well, if you look at the slave rolls, as Barbara Fields, a Carthaginius Award winner, historian at Columbia University, taught me in college, if you look at the slave rolls, what you'll see in the 1600s and even the early 1700s is that as slaves are picked up in West Africa, they are referred to by their nationality. If you know your Greek history, if you know your Roman history, if you know your world history, then you know that slavery was not new in the 1600s. It had been going on for millennia. And people were accustomed to enslaving people of other nations. So it was not weird to pick up a slave and write down their nationality, and that's what they did. At this port in West Africa, we picked up 16 Ghanaians. At this port in West Africa, we picked up 15 Cote d'Ivoirians. But by the mid to late 1700s, something is different. You look at the slave rolls, and what do they say? In this port in Cote d'Ivoire, we picked up 6 cattle, 12 chickens, and 15 Negroes. And we're referred to as English. And what happened in that period? The rise of modern science, and with it, this fantastical categorization of humans based on like nose shape and hair texture and skin color, which put the Anglo-Saxon at the top and made the African the missing link between humans and monkeys. There was no science in that science. There was a lot of hubris, maybe some arrogance, but no science. And it was used with a ferocity that suggested that maybe this British, this English, this Anglo-Saxon fascination with race, maybe the way it was being used was new, but maybe that wasn't new either. Now, when I was a student at Oxford, I was a bartender. And as a bartender, the most challenging thing in England is pouring beer. In America, you can slam down the tap and fill it up as fast as you want, and there'll be a head like this, and people sort of enjoy like blowing it off. But in England, the expectation is that the beer is glassy on top. You can see the bottom of the glass. They don't want any suds. And if it's Guinness, well, that's a problem because the suds will never go away. And so pouring Guinness is an art form, a very slow art form. You tip the glass and ease back on the tap. And so I was hanging out with a local bartender at a local kind of towny bar. You want to see town-gown tensions, go to Oxford. They're like 1,000 years old and counting. And there were 4 local men at a table, and they were maybe 5 of them, and they were talking about the 4 races. And I was studying comparative social research and comparative U.S. domestics. I was kind of eavesdropping while I was watching Stockport Guinness. And they weren't talking about like Native Americans, black folks, Latinos, and whites. No, they were talking about Welsh, Scots, Irish, and Anglo-Saxons. And once again, of course, Anglo-Saxons were at the top. But the vitriol that they spewed, their stereotypes for Scots were similar to the stereotypes you've heard from anti-Semites about Jewish people. Their stereotypes for Welsh were similar to stereotypes that you hear about Native Americans. And their stereotypes for Irish, not surprisingly, were similar to what you hear about black folks. In the British press, historically, the only two groups we repeatedly portrayed as apes and monkeys are Africans and Irish. I wanted to go over and be like, y'all chill, where I'm from, y'all what? Just chill out. But it was a reminder that the notion of race, I mean, you think about it here, we Scots, we are a mighty race. The notion of race is a British word for tribe. And the racial divisions in the British Isles go back to the Anglo-Saxon conquests. And the stereotypes were used with similar ferocity and deadly consequences. When the Anglo-Saxons, for example, got to Scotland, they came back to Oxford and other places, Westminster, and they said, oh, we've encountered two types of natives. They're the civilized natives. They recognize the inherent superiority of the Anglo-Saxon on sight. Today you would call those like collaborators or traders, but back then they called them civilized. And there are the savages, and the savages, respond the way that we might respond if somebody showed up at our front yard and said our house was theirs. When they got to Ireland, they came back, they said there are no civilized natives in Ireland, they are all savages. And the response was, well then kill them all and replace them with the teeming hordes of London. If you want to know why Frederick Douglass, when he ran away from slavery, ended up developing a bromance with a Catholic priest in Ireland as he was against the Protestants, who were abolitionists, and he was earning the purse to purchase his freedom. But a lot of American civil rights organizing actually goes back to an Irish Catholic priest in Ireland who taught Frederick Douglass how to organize while he was over there. He was building a penny a year campaign, a penny a year membership organization, precursor to the NAACP that was an anti-colonial organization. And so, when we talk about the origin of race in this country, let us be clear. We are ultimately dealing with a notion that predates our country, that is rooted in colonial abuses that happened before slavery as we know it in America began. And if there's cause to be optimistic in this country, it's that the first rebellions in America were not slave rebellions, they were colonial rebellions. And when we learn that our children's future may not be any better, may in fact be worse than our own, we would rebel together. And I would offer to you that the times we are living in right now are those sorts of rebel together kind of times. And there is a muscle memory in the American people that predates race, that goes back to that common shared colonial experience, that draws us together across those lines. And all you have to do is look at young people. In Bernie Sanders' campaign, for example. And you see glimpses of that. I've seen kids in the Ozarks come together across race. I've seen kids in Mississippi come together across race in ways that I, as an old organizer, would not have expected. But they're coming together because black and white is over-incarcerated in this country. Because black and white is over-indebted going to university in this country. Because black and white is worried about their future. Now, talking about the consequences, it gets a little easier to just pull out of sort of our day-to-day and talk about domestic security for a second. Follow me. Anybody remember the DC sniper case? Is there any transplants who were like, say, in Maryland or in DC when that was going on? Like I was? All right, you all recall. We were told our neighbors were being killed every morning, every night. Every morning, every night, Monday through Friday. We were told, if you got to go to the gas station, please don't stop moving while you're pumping gas. Literally, they were saying, just think of your personal theme song. They didn't have music playing at the pump those days, at least not so frequent, so you could see everybody at a different beat pumping their gas. We were told, look, if you got to go to the big box store, walk in a zigzag so they can't keep a beat on you. Total state of terror. Every morning, every night. Every morning, every night. The police get psychologists, they get on the air, and they put together a profile. It's important to understand that profiles used in law enforcement when you don't have a suspect. You don't have a suspect-specific description. What it is a guess. And it starts with the things that are most likely, and it ends with the things that are biggest guesses. So it starts off, the suspect is probably antisocial. Yes, they're killing people like every day. Check. The suspect is probably traveling alone or in a small group. Well, yeah, if there was like 40 of them, we probably would have caught him by now. The suspect is probably military trained. Pretty good shot. The suspect is probably male. The suspect is probably white. At that time I was working at Amnesty International, and I was actually doing a report on racial profiling post 9/11. And one of my favorite guys ran the IT department. Always important, get to know the guy in the IT department. He and I started on the same day. He was my drinking buddy. Big redhead, heavy-set preacher from Roanoke. He and his wife were street corner preachers on the weekend, and he'd commute up to work, support their kids, and he'd go back. So he usually got there early because he wanted to beat the rush, but this time he's coming in at 10 a.m. Now, I live 5 blocks away. I always came in at 10 a.m. So I bumped him, and I'm like, Brian, what's up, man? Why are you here so late? He's like, man, craziest thing happened today on the Beltway. One of those shootings happened, and next thing I know, they were pulling me over. I had my hands up. I looked to my left. It's all white guys like me. I looked to my right. It's all white guys like me. I said, oh, Brian, you were just racially profiled. Why don't we have lunch? We'll talk about it. There's a black guy who looks vaguely Arab. Every time there's a Gulf War, man, I can't get through the airport. So, how do we have lunch? In the middle of it, I'm with Dave Chappelle. Dave is my godbrother. He's my godfather's son. And we're at the safest place you can be in Washington, D.C. We are in the center of the city, not in the Beltway. We're in a brick building in a cellar comedy club. And it's Saturday night. And Dave and I have been talking about it, and it had gone from being a white man to being a white van, and so literally in my office on Pennsylvania Avenue, every time there was a white van, they would surround it, pull everybody out, 12 Latino day laborers, put them all back in the van. Dave and I were trying to figure things out, and in the middle of his comedy routine, Dave did something that he still does this. Every now and then he uses me as like the straight man. I'm the foil. So he goes, Ben! I said, yeah, Dave? He said, I figured it out. I said, figured out what? He said, remember, this is Dave Chappelle said this, not me. He says, the killer's gotta be black. I said, Dave, why? He said, brother, think about it. White psychopaths don't take off the weekend. Chappelle says, Boston Strangler, Jack the Ripper did their best work on the weekends. He's like, what, brother? He might take off the weekend. Dave, in his twisted mind, was starting at behavior and working his way towards race. The police, on the other hand, were starting at race and ignoring behavior. When the suspect was finally found in his military jacket, smelling because he was only taking a shower once a week, which is a sign of psychosis if you've ever had to deal with community-level folks. The chief of police said once, something he would never repeat again. Law enforcement stopped these two men 9 times before we checked the trunk. 9 times. Sometimes you look at the reports, there was 1 person in the vehicle, sometimes there was 2. There was always 2 in the vehicle. It's just that sometimes John Muhammad was clutching, Leroy Malvo, the boy, was clutching the rifle in the trunk where they had drilled out a hole he was shooting through. That car was covered in gunpowder. They had been shooting from the vehicle. They never so much as brought a dog around. My neighbors would still be alive. But white guys like Brian, and black guys like Leroy Malvo, and John Muhammad, who was wearing his army jacket the whole time with his name on it, like the third thing was probably military trained, and he's wearing his army jacket with his name on it, and they let him, oh, go on through. So, start thinking about it, and you say, well, maybe we're so hardwired in our biases that we just can't ever move past them. And in that thing, there was gender and there was race. And then you say, Squeaky Fromm. Squeaky Fromm took a shot at Gerald Ford, and what changed the next day? They started searching women's purses. Since the creation of the Secret Service, there had been a rule: do not humiliate a woman by going into her purse. 1 shot at Gerald Ford, and they changed it right away. And whose life did that save? George H.W. Bush. A woman came to one of his rallies with a pistol in her purse, and the Secret Service had been checking purses for almost a generation, and they found the purse and saved this thing. So then you say to yourself, well, geez, maybe all we need, we have like a gender Squeaky Fromm, maybe we need a racial Squeaky Fromm, and we can finally move beyond this foolishness. And you go through your history, and you find presidential assassinations, and you find out actually we did a long time ago. President McKinley, 1901. But back then, he was a very popular guy. He was re-elected to the presidency. He was celebrating. Today, he's like a footnote, and that's how Teddy Roosevelt became president. He was working the rope line at an exposition in upstate New York when 3 shots were fired at point-blank range by a man with a pistol hidden in a crude bandage. 2 hit the president squarely in the stomach. The 3rd one would glance off to the side, and somebody in the crowd tackled the president to protect him. It was one of the assassinations, along with Lincoln's, a series of others that led to the creation of the Secret Service. The law enforcement officer in charge of the expedition went to interrogate the officers in charge of that rope line. And he said, you were supposed to check every single person who walked through your rope line, top to bottom, and you let somebody walk through with a pistol in their hand, crudely disguised in some muslin that was supposed to look like a bandage? What happened? You know from the records that the officer at the rope line said, well, we thought you looked like any other mechanic out for a day at the fair, and he looked like he had a bum hand, so we didn't want to hurt him. But we're pretty sure that he had a decoy working with it. You see, at the time, the profile for a would-be president assassin was an Eastern European anarchist. The Russian premier had been assassinated a few years earlier by some anarchists from Eastern Europe. And they said at the time, leaders of the world, beware, for you are next. Leaders of the West, beware, for you are next. And again, they didn't know like who was the Eastern European anarchist who might come try to kill the President of the United States. So they had a profile. And in the profile there would be unusually tall, probably swarthy, and probably have exotic facial hair. So going back to the alleged decoys, we're pretty sure he had a decoy. Because right behind him was a man we checked top to bottom multiple times. We all kept an eye on him. He was 6'4". He was swarthy, and he had a long mustache. They said, please, fan out. Find the decoy. We need all of them. Come back and say, oh, I got good news about that. He said, oh, what's the good news? We found the alleged decoy. Well, what's the bad news? That's retired Georgia Constable Big Jim Parker, who tackled the president to save them before our boys could get there. And it's not like the American people weren't informed that this black retired constable had saved the president's life. No, newspapers back then were like CNN. They could keep telling you the same story until it stopped selling ads. So his face was on the morning and evening editions, pretty much of every paper in the United States for a week while the president was treated and would ultimately die from bad medicine. McKinley actually didn't die from the bullets. He died from like leeches and a whole bunch of crazy things that they did to that point. But it's a reminder that we knew more than a century ago that when you insert race into the equation, in the absence of a suspect, you make law enforcement blind to the behaviors that are the actual threat. And it's so dangerous that it literally cost a president of the United States his life. Because the assailant was an Eastern European anarchist. He was 5'8", he was blonde-haired, and he was blue-eyed and clean-shaven. His name was Leon Schultz. Color, hair color, facial hair doesn't tell people what you believe or what you're about to do. That's your mind. And there's not a thing about what somebody looks like. In fact, study criminology is a thing called carnival theory. Carnival theory is this, and it points throughout society. There are these choke points, like a turnstile at the carnival. And everybody has to pass through them. And when there's a criminal network, there's a terrorist network, there's a network of drug distributors, they send multiple decoys through those choke points to see who gets caught and who always goes through. And the one who always goes through, they send with the package. And the one who always goes through doesn't fit the stereotype. So what do we do now? It's Martin Luther King Day. We've been coming for 36 years, celebrating for 36 years here. What do we do? No. If you haven't listened to Dr. King's last sermon, not his last speech, not the mountaintop speech from the night before his assassination, the sermon from the Sunday prior, it's worth revisiting. In that sermon, Dr. King essentially says what he said so many times since the letter from the Birmingham jail. It's not good enough for good people to know what's right and believe what's right. They have to do what's right. And each of us in our daily lives is called repeatedly to be courageous. And if you can't remember a moment that you have been courageous in the interest of ending discrimination against people of color, against women, against the LGBT community, against Native Americans recently, chances are you're not doing enough. What gives me hope in these times is ultimately a couple of things. One, as I said, is that something in motion tends to return to its original state. Now look at these young people in this country, coming together out of necessity to push us towards a better, more inclusive future. It gives me hope. I get up on the balcony of history and I think about the ferocity that my dear friend Stacey Abrams, she ran for governor in Georgia, the ferocity she faced as the vote was systematically suppressed by a Secretary of State who wanted to make sure that he became governor and his party held on to power, not her and ours. And I actually, as angry as I am, Stacey and I have been dear friends who are 20 years old. It gives me a little bit of hope. Because as Frederick Douglass reminded us a long time ago, power concedes nothing without a man. The struggle may be moral, it may be physical, it may be moral and physical, but there always must be a struggle. And this is exactly what you would expect to happen when there are massive democratic shifts happening in our country that push us to a place where we will all have to experience the humble position of being in a minority and having to ask others for help. It was within my lifetime that white men could decide who became president of these United States. It has not been since Reagan that was possible. And now we are reaching a place where our nation, as they say, will be a majority-minority nation. Newsflash, y'all, that's an oxymoron. It means everybody will be a minority. And every group will have to figure out how to get it along at least one other group demographically in order to succeed democratically. And that gives me hope. Because absolute power corrupts absolutely. And a little humility is good for all of us. Ultimately, I am buoyed by the vision that buoyed Dr. King. It's a vision laid out by Frederick Douglass in the years after the Civil War. If you haven't read a 19th century speech recently, I would encourage you to read Frederick Douglass' speech on composite nationality, and we'll close on this. The man was an incredible ally and very courageous in very tough times. He had a construction company. He was a banker. He was a federal marshal. He was a leader in the Republican Party. He was the most photographed American of the 19th century. He had been held and tortured as a slave. His father was a slave owner. His mother was a slave. And yet he had tremendous grace when he helped win the vote for black men because it was a gendered vote. He said he would not cast his vote until women had the right to vote too. When he was questioned about his second wife, who was white, he made one statement. He said, "My first wife was the color of my mother. My second wife was the color of my father." He's a bad dude. Living south of Mason-Dixon, like, you're surrounded when you're in Washington, D.C. back there. And he came out like a lion against the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that's what his speech on composite nationality is ultimately response to. And in that speech against that law, very similar in spirit to these essentially Latino Exclusion Acts we've seen passed in multiple states, he says this, and I'll paraphrase him and then I'll quote him, because, you know, if you haven't read a 19th century orator recently, it's like trying to read the King James Bible out loud. Quickly feel confused and antiquated. So he says, my son said to me, "What does thou mean again?" It means you, son. Oh, okay, why don't we say you? He says, every nation has a unique destiny. Its destiny is based on its character. Its character is defined by that nation at its best, not its worst. Charitable words for a man who had been held and tortured as a slave. And ultimately, every nation's character is shaped by its geography, and we are bordered north and south by friendly nations of different races. And east and west. The Jealousies, my dad's family came through Ellis Island. That's where the funny name came from. Great oceans, east and west, that connect us to every people on the planet, and our destiny, based on our character being us at our best and shaped by that very unique geography, is to be, and I quote, the most perfect example of the unity and dignity of the human family that the world has ever known. Sisters and brothers, the history of Oklahoma, the history of America reminds us we have been through tougher moments than this, but because regular people like us accepted their responsibility, the words of Dr. King, to work with God, to do great things, the arc of the moral universe and of our nation has ultimately always been bent towards justice. I'm here tonight out of respect for friends old and new, to encourage each of you, however many more days the universe or God, whether you don't believe or you do believe like I do, gives you, to put your hand on that arc and bend it towards justice. Because our nation that has a destiny that might be derailed, but cannot be denied. Thank you, and God bless.